Hi Afia, I hope I am audible and the screen is also visible. Okay, so I will, one second, let me look at this lecture 21, slide 186. One second. Is it about the push and pull factors? Lecture 21, slide 186. One second. One 78. Ah, yes. So are you talking about the temperature tolerance varies with the acclimation temperature? Is that what you're? One second, I will display my screen. And is this the slide that you're talking about? Okay, now I cannot. Yeah. Is this the slide that you're talking about? Yes. Okay. So varies with acclimation temperature, diesel temperature reaction. Okay, yeah. So in this slide, what he's talking about basically is that if you suddenly increase the temperature of a certain species, so if a certain species, say, is used to staying at a temperature of around, say, 20 degrees Celsius or 25 degrees Celsius, and you suddenly shoot up the temperature to 35 degrees Celsius, then it will not be able to tolerate that sudden change in temperature. But if you allow the species some time to acclimatize with the temperature, for example, if you want to increase the temperature and you do it in steps, you take it from 20 to say 22 and then 26, and then increase, like you let the species acclimatize at 22 for some time, then you increase it to 26, then it will be the species will have a better chance of surviving. So acclimation basically means you let it get used to that particular temperature before increasing it further. So in this, what he's basically trying to say is this only, that if you suddenly increase the temperature, the species will not be able to survive. in that, or you suddenly decrease it anyway. If a sudden change is going to hamper the species survival, but if you allow it some time to get acclimatized at that particular temperature, if you like alter it a little bit by 2 degrees or by 3 degrees and let it stay, then the chances of survival of that species are better, and more individuals will be able to survive even if you increase the temperature in the end by around 10 degrees Celsius. Is that Does that clear your doubt? Okay, so what are you unable to understand in this? Okay, explain the graph. Right. Okay. So on the x-axis, it has the acclimation temperature. That means at the temperature at which the species is, the species is used to staying, right? As in, the species is acclimatized to this temperature, it is able to tolerate this temperature, which is on the x axis. And on the y axis, we have the lethal temperature. That is the temperature at which this particular species is going to, it will not be able to tolerate that temperature and it will die at that temperature. So what this graph is showing is this species which has low acclimation temperatures, it has consequently, it has low lethal temperatures. And if the acclimation temperature of that particular species or the tolerable temperature is high, the lethal temperature is also high. So it is saying the bullyhead is a highly tolerant species in contrast to the chum salmon. So this is the bullyhead and this is the chum salmon, right? Which is one of the least resistant studied to date. So it's basically saying that the species, the the bullhead is able to tolerate higher temperatures, and that is why the lethal temperatures for that species are also high. But for the so for both of these, in the same species graph, if you look at this, so if you acclimatize it to live at a little higher temperature, right, it can survive till here. If it's acclimatized to this, then its lethal temperature is also a little higher than it would have otherwise been if it was not acclimatized. And same goes for the bullhead. If it is acclimatized to higher temperatures, the lethal temperature will also be high. It can tolerate this much temperature before that temperature is lethal for the species. Is it clear now? Like the x-axis? Okay. Okay. So yeah. So should we move on to today's tutorial? Or does anybody have any more doubts? We can talk about them. So, okay, should I move on to the tutorial presentation? Okay, so just give me a minute to present. Okay. So, yes. So, is the screen visible? Okay, yeah. So, today we're going to be discussing the eighth week of wildlife ecology. And as you know, I am Geetika Agarwal. I am a PhD scholar at CES, and I'll be taking today's tutorial for the wildlife ecology course, which is taught by Ankur Awadhiya. Okay, so in the eighth week, we've discussed mostly about management of threatened species. And in the lectures, we discussed what are the various threats that are faced by the species out there, the wildlife, may it be plants or animals or anything. And we talked about in situ conservation practices, and we also discussed some ex situ conservation practices. So, this is going to be an overview and a summary of the week. So, why are species under threat? So, as you might be aware by now, that the various things that a species faces or is under threat of is because of unsuitable habitat, which could be because of there is habitat loss, there is competition. So unsuitable habitat could be because of many reasons. It could be because of human intervention in the habitat, because the habitat has been fragmented, or because of climate change, because of intolerable temperatures, because of unfavorable precipitation, these things. Then there is habitat loss, which can also be which also covers the habitat fragmentation, the degradation, or the change in the habitat. Then there is competition, which is faced either by invasive species or the competition that you face by other competitors in the natural habitat, or predation pressure. Then there could be killing, hunting, poaching, which is done by humans. It is carried out by humans for illegal trade or for eating purposes, things like that, or for pet trade or fur trade, all of these things. And then there is stochastic factors, that is factors that like environmental fluctuations or catastrophes, factors that you cannot like determine already. So, two broad categories in which we can put these threats, or two broad paradigms in which you can put these threats, includes the declining population paradigm, which basically includes all the factors that push the population, the normal population size, towards smaller population sizes by population dynamics. Or it can be the small population paradigm, which are factors that push these small populations toward extinction. One second. Yeah. Okay, so there is the declining population paradigm, which basically means that you're pushing the population towards smaller sizes, and there is small population paradigm, which is pushing these small populations towards extinction. So, can you guys tell me, out of these factors here on the left, which of them fall under the declining population paradigm and which of them fall under the small population paradigm? Or in general, which factors uh, comprise of the declining population paradigm and which factors comprise of the small population paradigm? Stochastic is under which one? Which category? Small. Okay, yeah. So these stochastic factors, they fall under the small population paradigm, because these are the factors that can in the end lead to, they can provide that small nudge to a already small population to tip it over to extinction. So these are these factors like these forest fires or floods or all these things. But the in general, the other factors, which is an unsuitable habitat, which could be because of temperature, precipitation, or environmental factors, the loss of habitat, fragmentation of habitat, degradation, competition faced by other species, and the killing of this particular species, all of these, they lead to the decline in the population. That affect a large population lead to decline in numbers. That is why they fall under the declining population paradigm. Stochastic factors do not really affect a large population. If a species already has a large population, the stochastic factors are not going to affect it so much because it can always bounce back and regain its population, its normal population size. But it is going to tip over a very small population and make it go extinct. Okay, so moving on. So I have some of these factors listed here on the left, and you have to categorize them as either deterministic factors or stochastic factors. So here we have birth rate, environmental fluctuation, migration, catastrophes, density dependent mortality, death rate, population structure, and genetic factors. So can you guys tell me which of these fall under which categories? Okay, so is birth rate, okay, 1D. So 1D, you mean birth rate should be a deterministic factor. Okay. Environmental fluctuations should be stochastic factor. Migration, stochastic factor. Okay. Catastrophe, you're saying, is a stochastic factor. What about others? So how will you categorize the other factors? Death rate is a deterministic factor. Okay. Population structure is a deterministic factor. Right. Genetic factors are stochastic. And so density dependent mortality is also a stochastic factor. Okay. So you have correctly uh, categorized these factors. So birth rate, death rate, and population structure, these come under deterministic because you can actually go out and measure these, and then you can predict what is going to happen to the birth rate or what is going to happen to the death rate of this particular species or this particular population. Because the birth rate and the death rate, they are going to be mostly controlled by what is the current population size. How many adults do you have? How many, say, how many individuals you have that have attained the sexual maturity? How many females are there? And what is the on average, say, the clutch size or the brood size that they're having? So these factors you can determine and you can also predict them. But for the stochastic factors, you don't know what is going to be a sudden environmental fluctuation. We don't know if there's going to be a sudden fire or there's going to be a flood, and how is that going to impact the population. Is it going to have a very severe impact, or is the population somehow going to get saved and not get affected by it so much? We don't know if these individuals, they're going to migrate from this area, they're going to leave this area, and if they'll come back or if they'll not be able to make it back to this, to our particular habitat. And then inbreeding, depression, loss of heterogeneity, these are all, these fall under the stochastic categories. Okay, moving on. So I was going to ask you what are our selected species, but okay. So our selected species are species that have a high birth rate. They, which means that at a time when they are reproducing, they have huge, they have a, they have large number of offsprings. they produce a higher number of offsprings in one bout of reproduction. Then they reach their sexual maturity sooner. So, like at small ages, they reach their sexual maturity. They have little to no parental care. The offsprings of an R selected species, they can mostly take care of themselves. That stems from the fact that they have little to no parental care. And these R selected species in general have shorter lifespans. And opposite to this will be the K selected species, which will have all of these things opposite. These had a higher birth rate, the case selected species have a low birth rate. They reach their sexual maturity later in life, after, say, after some amount of their lifespan. They have substantial parental care. They spend a lot of time taking care of their offsprings. And since they have a low birth rate, they have a few offsprings, one or two per, say, reproduction bout. They take care of these offsprings, and they till they are able to take care of themselves. And mostly in these cases, the offsprings are altricial. They're not able to take care of themselves. For example, like we're born as humans, we are not able to walk, we're not able to talk, we mostly sleep all the time, we cry all the time, and we will not be able to take care of ourselves. In in the other way, a precocial species would be rats, or like mosquitoes. They just lay their eggs, or even rats, they give birth to their offsprings, and then they don't worry about them. They like, on all these insect species which lay their eggs, and then the adults, they go away. These uh, offsprings, they have to take care of themselves. They hatch out of the eggs, they become the larvae, and then they molt, and then they become adults. So there is no parental care involved in their case. And the case selected species mostly have longer lifespans. So if you will look at the graphs for R selected and case selected species, they will look somewhat like this. So you have a population size on the y axis, and you have time on the x axis. So with time, the population size of a case selected species from a lower size, it will increase eventually, and once it reaches the carrying capacity, it will stay more or less close to the carrying capacity. There are no sudden fluctuations in the population of a case selected species. But for an R selected species, you can have sudden bouts of increase or decrease in the population. Say, for example, there is a mosquito, it laid a lot of eggs in one pond. If that pond were to get destroyed, or if, say, a human came by and it sprayed pesticides in that area, then there will be a sudden decrease in the population of mosquitoes in that area. But if there was no intervention, there could be a sudden increase in the population also. And it is not governed much by the carrying capacity of that area, because these offsprings will get born, and eventually they'll face competition, and they might die out, and they will then decrease their population. But the population size is not going to stay close to the carrying capacity as it stays for the case selected species. So moving on to, so here are three survivorship curves. So do you guys know how to read a survivorship curve? On the x-axis, you have the lifespan of, yeah, altricial means that these offsprings, they cannot take care of themselves. This is the term which is mostly used for birds. There are there are two terms. There is altricial and precocial. So precocial offspring is one which is mostly in birds. The precocial offsprings, they are born with feathers. They are born, they can look around, they can walk by themselves, they can take care of themselves, which is mostly, the example includes ducks and these shorebirds. But for altricial species, like you in general see around yourself, there are mynas, there are crows. In those, the offsprings are born featherless, they're born blind, they're not able to open their eyes, and they're not able to take care of themselves. They cannot walk around. They stay in the nest, and these birds, they take care of their offsprings, and they come and feed them, and like that. So that is altricial and precocial. Is it okay? Okay. So moving on, so these are survivorship curves. Here is the lifespan of the individuals of that particular species. It could be from young to old, and this is the survivorship. So there are three types of survivorship curves out there. The type 1 curve includes species in which the survivorship is mostly high for young to medium aged individuals, and then most deaths are seen at an old age in these particular species that follow the type 1 survivorship curve. For type 2 survivorship curves, the survivorship, it continuously decreases linearly with age. So young ones have high survivorship, but as they grow old, the survivorship keeps on decreasing continuously. So this is an intermediate survivorship curve between type 1 and type 3, and the type 3 are the ones which have a high mortality at a young age, but then the survivorship stays more or less the same from like mature individuals to old individuals. So, can you now tell me how do you think the survivorship curve looks for an R selected species, and how does it look for a K selected species? Like for an R selected species where there are a huge number of offsprings that are born, like the the number of eggs that are laid, that is high. So what do you think, what is the survivorship curve for them? And on the other hand, yes, so for the K selected species, what would be the survivorship curve? So you're correct, Afia. For the R-selected species, it mostly follows a type 3 survivorship curve because in like insects, they lay a huge amount of eggs and not all of them are going to become larvae. And if they become larvae, a lot of them are going to be fed upon by their predators. So they have huge competition and huge amount of mortality in the young stages. And that is why the survivorship reduces. But then after they attain maturity, they will survive more or less till when they are old. They have more or less the same amount of survivorship. But for K selected species, you have high survivorship when you're young because, of course, you have a lot of parental care, and parents are investing a lot of their resources into taking care of their young ones and into making them reach maturity. And once they reach maturity, they have their own offsprings. Then, eventually, by the old age, they have a high amount of mortality. And type 2 is for individuals, for species that fall in between these two, that fall in the middle of the spectrum of severely R selected and highly K selected species. Okay. So, why do you think is a species rare? Since we're talking about conservation in this week, we know that it's important for us to take care of species that are rare in a particular habitat or in a particular ecosystem. But what are the factors that are leading to the rarity of a species? Why is that species rare? Can you guys give me a few reasons why do you think is a particular species rare in a given area? Or say in general? Low population, limited distribution. Yeah, that is correct. So can you elaborate a little? Why do you think it has a low population? Or why does it have a limited distribution? Yes, they are not generalist species, that is correct. They would fall under the category of a specialist species because they have some specific requirements. Okay, so you both are, maybe some evolutionary factors lead them to be specified in some space. Yeah, so you both are correct. So basically a species will be rare if it is a specialist of some sorts, and it is going to select its habitats, and there are certain specific evolutionary characteristics that limit it to stay in a certain area. And as you said, there is a limited geographical range, there is a low population density. So all of these factors, they lead to a species being rare, which basically just means that the population sizes are small. They are and they are not found everywhere in the world. They are limited to certain specific areas. They would mostly be endemics to certain areas, and if they're lost from that area, they're lost forever. And that why they are endemics would be because certain behavioral characteristics make them specialized to be in that habitat, because the certain range of temporal and factors like temperatures and precipitation, moisture, or nutrients in that area, that like make them limit their distribution to that particular area, because those factors are only found in that specific habitat. So these are certain reasons that make a species rare. And obviously we need to pay more attention to such species when we talk about conservation, or if you're trying to save species from getting extinct, because these are at a higher threat of getting extinct from the face of earth. So what so as I said, okay, a rare species is obviously susceptible to extinction, but what else do you think makes a species susceptible to extinction? What are the factors? So much of the answer, I think, was given away in the last slide, because if a species is rare, it's obviously going to be susceptible to extinction. But what else affects the susceptibility of a species to getting extinct? Poaching, yes. These are some of the factors that, so you're talking about killing, hunting, poaching, that humans carry out. What I'm asking is also more from the species point of view. Like, yes, there is habitat loss. What I'm asking is more from the species point of view, like, if the species has certain specific features, it is going to be more susceptible to extinction. Okay, they have low reproductivity. So basically, if it's a case selected species, it is going to be more susceptible to extinction, right? Limited tolerance level, very nice. So these are some of the features. So as we discussed, so if it's a rare species, it's probably going to be a specialist. And if these species are specialists, that means that their requirements are very specific to, say, the nutrients they are taking. So basically maybe the prey, they have very specific prey species, or if they are, say, they are herbivores, then they have very specific trees or fruits that they're feeding on. Say for example, if it's in the case of birds, maybe their beak structure is such that they can only exploit certain specific resources and not all of them. So they're probably going to be specialists. Second thing is the selection of habitat, as we discussed. Probably they have certain specific things that they're looking for in their habitat, and that is how they choose their habitat, and they're endemic to that place. Maybe they're unable to move out of that space. If you're talking about, say, frogs or snakes, they have limited dispersal abilities. A frog cannot, cross big gaps in mountain ranges and move from one mountain to another. So if it's limited to a particular mountain range, if the habitat there is lost, that frog species or that particular snake species is going to be lost. So probably they're endemic to where they're living. They cannot disperse out of that area, or they are specialized to that area. Then these species might be, or are more likely to be, species that have more overlap with human dominated landscapes. So if where they are living, humans are encroaching that area, or we have, say, we have other interests in that area. Maybe we want to carry out mining in that area because it's very mineral rich area, or we want to build a dam in that area. So if humans are interests are overlapping with where the organism is found, most probably it is going to be susceptible to extinction. And then there are these stochastic and deterministic factors that we discussed already. Okay, so moving on, how do humans impact habitats? So in a way, if you're impacting habitat, is how we are impacting the species that are living in their habitat. So how we are impacting the habitats, there are four broad categories. There is degradation, there is fragmentation, displacement, and loss. So can you guys tell me what are these four categories and how they're different from each other? What is habitat degradation, what is fragmentation, what is displacement, and what is loss? These terms are not very different from each other, but they do have certain specific things that are specific to them, like, and how they're different from each other. So it is important to note these certain specific differences. Pollution is degradation, yes. So degradation of a habitat can be caused by pollution or contamination of that habitat. You're correct. What else? Okay. So you're correct, Afia. If there is a loss in the quality of the habitat, then that is categorized as degradation. And as Rajeshri also mentioned, so pollution is one of the things that is going to lead to a loss of the quality of the habitat. So the habitat quality is not as good as it used to be. So even though the species can still survive here, but it is not optimal for it. So it refers to a condition where the quality of the habitat is severely affected and it is not as suitable for the species as it used to be. So what is fragmentation? So this should be very simple. What is habitat fragmentation, or how do you define habitat fragmentation? The habitat is broken into subparts. That is correct. So can you elaborate how that might happen, or like how is it brought about? What causes habitat fragmentation? Yeah, it could be because of the building of roads. So you're correct. So habitat fragmentation basically involves when the, yes, encroachment. So it basically involves the natural habitat. If it was, say, a big landscape, it is broken down into smaller fragments of the habitat. Mostly happens in human dominated landscapes. And you're correct. What will happen is humans will encroach the area. They will probably build a tiny trail and they will say that, okay, it's now just accessible and we can walk through it. And maybe we can, fell a little small number of trees and we can utilize them for ourselves. Then eventually they will say, okay, yeah, this area is much better, we can build a road through it so that it's more accessible. And then if there's a road built through it, then there will be more people who will try and settle in that area. There will be, say, certain populations who just start cutting down some trees and they will start agriculture in that area. And if they see potential in that land, if they see a market, then industries are going to come into that area. So that is how it will eventually going to lead to fragmentation, because if, we're going to keep cutting down the forest into smaller and smaller parts, and these parts may be connected, may be disconnected from each other, but that is one ways in how humans carry out habitat fragmentation. So what do we mean by habitat displacement? Or what is habitat displacement and what is habitat loss? Habitat displacement is when wildlife moves away from the prime habitat. Yes, you are correct. So displacement would be that the wildlife is basically forced to move away from their prime habitat into other areas which might be subprime or not optimal to that particular species. This could happen because of flooding, because of, say, humans were building a dam and now there is flooding of that area. The entire area is underwater, or like it's submerged in the reservoir water, and then the species will be forced to migrate or to displace away from that area so that they avoid these water submerged lands. It could also be because of cattle grazing. When humans, they take out their cattle, domesticated cattle, out to grazing in the landscape, and then these cattle, they are competing against the wildlife of that area, against the deers that are found in that area, or against other say herbivores in that area, and they are driving them further away into the forest, and they're encroaching in that land. And mostly with themselves, the cattles, they come with these um, dogs that people domesticate to look after the cattle. These dogs are gonna drive away other herbivores and even humans themselves. If their cattle is under threat because of any wildlife, because of say some carnivores, they're gonna kill them, and that is going to lead to that is going to force the wildlife to displace from that area. And the habitat loss in last. So how would you define a habitat loss? Yeah. Correct. So the habitat is no longer in a condition that this particular species can live there. So the quality of habitat has degraded to such an extent that it cannot be occupied any longer and you cannot stay there. So that will be called a complete loss. So I hope it is clear how these terms, even though they might be related, but they are subtly different from each other. A degradation is not a complete loss of the habitat, but if the degradation is carried out to such an extent that it becomes inhospitable entirely, then you will call that as a habitat loss. Okay, so here are a few images, and can you guys tell me how will you like under what categories will you put them, or what are these images showing? So in this image, I guess okay, three is this three, or are you going like one, two, and three? Left below. Yeah, so can you tell me what is going on in the image? Like, can you make out what is the phenomena? This is how it used to look before, and this is the state now. You're correct. It is pollution eutrophication, right? So this is an example of a lake eutrophication. Here it was a very clear water, but now it is completely covered with algae. It like the Sechi depth would also be very low in this water. So this would be a habitat degradation. This, as you are correct, this would also be a habitat degradation because you can see that along these egrets there is a lot of pollution, there is a lot of trash in this area, and this is not a suitable habitat for them because they might be ingesting this trash, which is eventually going to lead to a death of several of these egrets. Here you see that there is second is fragmentation, correct? So very clearly in this image you can see that there are these two three small fragments of forested areas which are surrounded by a lot of agricultural land. So very clearly this is a habitat fragmentation, and here again you can call this a fragmentation if you're thinking about that the other habitat is still there, the forest is there, and only this much part has been cut down. If you want to categorize it as a habitat loss, you can do that as well because this entire area has been cleared off, and none of the forest species can now live in this area, so they will have to move away. If you want to call it displacement, you can call it that because again this area is lost and the species will have to displace further into the forest. And if you want to call it degradation, you can call it that as well. So this basically is just a image of deforestation, and at different levels you can call it different things. Four can be called a loss if there were no species. So I would have called it a loss if there were no egrets. Since this image very clearly has these birds, these egrets in this, that is why I'm calling it a pollution or a degradation because they're still here. So it is sort of loss of quality of the habitat, but it's still not become so inhospitable that they're not living here anymore, right? Okay, moving on to in situ conservation. So the second lecture was all about in situ conservation. Can you guys tell me what is in situ conservation? How do you define it? And like what is going on? Why do we do it? Yeah, conservation in the natural habitat would be in situ conservation. So, why would you like, how would you choose an area for an in situ or what are the steps? Sorry, what are the steps uh, when you're carrying out in situ conservation? Or when you're trying to set up, uh, say, a safe area, say a reserve or a national park? What are the various factors that we look at? Or what are the various steps that we follow before setting up a national park? You designate the area, you monitor management legislations. Okay, so you're correct. So, an in situ conservation basically are the conservation practices that are done within the natural habitat, as you already mentioned, of the given species. Examples would include national parks, there are biosphere reserves, there are wildlife sanctuaries, and the steps for doing this would be number one, you have to choose where you want to build your national park or biosphere reserve. Then you also have to choose the shape and size of the area that you want to designate as an in situ conservation area. And then in the end, you're going to manage that reserve, right? So, after having talked about this, let's discuss what are some of the advantages and what are some of the disadvantages. What are the pros and cons of in situ conservation? So, can you list out some of the pros of in situ conservation, or why would you prefer it in place of ex situ conservation? So can you guys tell me what are the certain pros? Okay, it's a wholesome conservation. It's less costly. Yeah, that is correct. Anything else? Wholesome conservation, I guess you're talking in the sense of like you're protecting the entire habitat and consequently all of the species that are there in the habitat, right? Yeah. Anything else? Here, I would also like to point out that one important thing in an in situ conservation is also when it comes to the factor of other species also get a benefit. Yeah, when it comes to the point of indigenous tribes, there are a lot of the times when these national parks and these biosphere reserves are being set up, and when the tribes that are living in that area that are being driven out of that area by the, say, the forest management or by the government rules and laws like that, that okay, this area is just going to be a wildlife reserve and there no human activity can be carried out at all. So do you think that is how an in situ conservation should be carried out? Or do you think the people that were already living in that area or they were living in the forest, they were living harmoniously with the forest? Do you think they should be driven out of their natural habitats? And yes, you're correct. There is no change in behavior. A lot of the time, when the wild behavior is lost in ex situ conservation, that is not going to happen in an in situ conservation practice. So, yeah, my question to you guys is that a lot of the times, the indigenous tribes that live in a particular area, they are driven out of there when the government is trying to set up, say, a conservation practice. There is a biosphere reserve, or there is a national park, and then they're trying to drive out these tribes that were already living in that area. Do you think that is correct, or do you think okay? You're saying no, they should not be driven out, right? But at some extent, they can be allowed. Yeah. So Yes. So that is one thing I wanted to just point out, that it's very important to bear in mind that these people or these tribes that are living harmoniously with the forest, they are aware of how the forest functions. They are aware of the different wildlife and how they manage their lives, and they're not, harming the forest. They're living in harmony with that area. And a lot of the times they also have these practices where they carry out these certain rituals. Say for example, they a lot of the time they're also wildlife wardens in, yes, exactly, they're also wildlife wardens in the region. They know that area better than the forest guards will do, or better than the people who are coming from outside will know the area, or better than us also who are studying about the area. They will know about it better because they have been born and brought up in that area. They know all about it. They know how these different species, when are they active, when they can be disturbed and when they should not be disturbed, when is their breeding time, or what do different bird calls means. All these things, they're aware of these things. And instead of driving them out of the area, it is more important that the forest government or the management, it joins forces with these people, with the tribal people living in these areas, and they learn from them and they manage it together. So there is this thing called the joint forest management, which has been carried out now in India in a lot of these areas where the forest government or the forest management, it comes together with the tribes, the local area, and they form a joint committee, and they then figure out how to manage that particular landscape and that particular habitat. So these are some things that we can do, and a lot of these times these tribes, they know much better, and they, in a way, they protect the area. Normally when we as urban dwellers, we just go and we, these various industries, they cut down the trees. They don't think about what they're doing. They just log down the forest for their own purposes, and they build their industries, or they use these logged forests, these trees, for furniture or for firewood and all these things. Mostly when you will notice is that these tribes, they have these small rituals where they take permission from, say, the local gods or the forest deities that they think of. And they have these small rituals, and they have this specific time period in which they take permission from these forest deities of whether they can take that particular forest resource or not, whether they can cut that tree or not, whether they can uh, take down those particular uh, bee nests for honey or not. And if, for example, their rituals mostly include of things like they're balancing a rock, and if it falls on one side, then they're going to use the forest resource. If it falls on the other side, they're not going to do it. So these are certain ways in which they themselves keep in check that they do not overexploit the area. Okay. So there was one thing about in situ conservation. So okay, we discussed about all of the pros. What are the cons of in situ conservation? Or when do you think it does not work? Or when do you think you would go for an ex situ conservation rather than an in situ conservation? Yeah, if the species at question is extremely sensitive and is the numbers are highly declining, you cannot, yes, you're correct. You cannot save them with in situ conservation. It's better to have a more intervening strategy, for example, in ex situ conservation. What else are the cons of an in situ conservation? Do you not think that, setting aside such a huge area for the habitat of the species is also one of the costs, because otherwise humans could have been using it to improve the economy of the country, to build, industries, or say cities, urban landscapes. Yeah, monitoring is also difficult. With the with the forest reserve, there is also going to come these rangers that you need to hire. You need an entire staff to look after, and you need patrolling of these areas so that there is no illegal poaching or things like that happening. So, yes, these are some of the cons of practicing in situ conservation. You need to set aside a huge amount of area. It is not useful if the species is already very sensitive and highly declining. Monitoring that area is difficult, all these factors. Okay, so how to choose areas for in situ conservation? So, how do you decide which areas you're going to choose for your in situ conservation, or which areas you're going to set aside as a biosphere reserve? So, some things, some scientific decisions you make in this sense are that you would look for areas in which the species richness is high. As we discussed, if an area is highly biodiverse, if the biodiversity is high, if the species richness is high, then that area is worth saving, because that community is complex and a lot of those links in the community, which means a lot of these species, they will be dependent on each other. And if any one of them gets affected, the others also might decline in their numbers, because there might have been certain links in the community that you were missing out but which already existed. So it's important to look out for areas which are highly specious. It is important to conserve areas which have high degrees of endemism, because as we all know, once that species is lost, it will not be found anywhere else. So if kangaroos are lost from Australia, they're lost from the world. If certain specific birds like the shola killies, which are found in the Western Ghats, if they're lost here, they're lost forever, like from the face of the earth. There are no more of those birds anywhere. And if the number of species that are under threat in that area is high, so if a lot of species in that area are under threat, then you would like to set aside that area as a conservation area or as a reserve. Okay, so all of these factors, they point towards a biodiversity hotspot. Mostly biodiversity hotspots are areas which have huge number of species. They are highly specious, they have high biodiversity. That is why they're called a biodiversity hotspot. They Most of the species that are found in these areas are not found anywhere else. They're endemics. And these are small areas which have high biodiversity proportional to the area as well. And because of habitat fragmentation, mostly these biodiversity hotspots, they are under threat. So you should look out for these areas and then set them aside for conservation. Okay, so now are some easy questions. So between the following two figures, which one will you choose for a biodiversity or for an in situ conservation practice? Will you choose this area which has uh, these fragments of forest patches, or will you choose this area with one big fragment or with one big patch of forest? This one. You would choose the one with the single huge forest patch. And why is that? Why will you make that choice? Why is this better than these? Okay, yeah, there is species richness. A bigger habitat is more likely to have uh, different types of niches and is more likely to be more species rich. There is one another important reason of why you would choose this instead of this. What can you say about a particular species, about the populations of a particular species that will be found here versus the populations that will be found here? Any guesses? Okay, so I would just like to say that one important factor that you've missed is in the bigger habitat, the population sizes will also be bigger, and all these populations will be connected. That is one important thing, because if the individuals can move within populations, then you might be able to guess that there will be gene flow within those populations. And if there is gene flow, there will be higher heterogeneity and there will be low inbreeding depression. Here in these fragments, the populations, they might not be able to move across these fragments. And in general, if this is a smaller area, it will be able to host a small number of individuals, and these individuals will then be prone to stochastic factors. They'll be prone to some small disease spread, or they'll be prone to, say, there was a forest fire in one of these patches. Then these areas, they will be prone to these stochastic factors. They might have inbreeding depression because they might not move out from these areas, all of these things. But the bigger one, it will not be prone to these stochastic factors. The populations here will be large in size, and they will be able to bounce back even if they face certain reduction in their sizes. And one thing that Afia pointed out was correct. This is most likely to have to be more species rich, because this is more likely to have more niches which are distributed and uh, over a particular gradient as compared to these smaller patches. Moving on. So, if both of these have an equal amount of area, which shape would you rather select for your habitat reserve, for your biosphere reserve? Would you want it to be a circular reserve, or would you want it to be a rectangular reserve, or like first one? Yeah. So, you would mostly go for a circular reserve. And why is that? Can you tell me why, the reason for this choice? You're correct. You should go for this one, but compact area in this or in this? Like, can you please elaborate? Okay, so one important reasons why we would choose a circular reserve instead of a rectangular one is because this has a bigger periphery. And here, if you have certain villages set up at the periphery, or you have human disturbances, then they will be mostly limited to the periphery. And they will not, like, if there is a disturbance here and if there's a disturbance here, there is still a large chunk of the patch in the center which will be unaffected by the human disturbance. But if in this forest patch you have disturbance on the peripheries, then there will be a very thin strip of land in the middle that might be unaffected, but most areas in the edges, they will be affected by the human disturbances. And because of that, there will be not be a significant amount of area in the middle which can still act as a reserve, or which can still act as a safe place for the wild habitats. Because mostly, you know that all of these reserves, they have a buffer zone around them. And if you even take out the buffer zone, you'll still have a bigger chunk of area in the middle, which is safe for the species, as compared to here. If you take out that same, say, 1 kilometer thick buffer zone, or like, okay, 5 kilometer thick buffer zone, you'll just left with a thin strip of land in the middle. Here, even if you take out the 5 kilometer thick buffer zone, you'll be having a chunk of forest in the middle that will be safe for your species. Okay, so moving on, choose from these choices. Okay, from the top two, which one will you choose? The forest fragments that are linearly distributed and like in a single file, or the ones that are yeah. So you're correct. So you will mostly choose a cluster of these habitats, because as it is, yes, because it is easily connected. Here you can see only the middle one is connected to the other two, and the rest, the peripheral ones, are only connected to one other forest patch. But here, all three of them are connected to each other. And since, as I already mentioned, these small populations, if they are connected to each other, it is much better, because then there can be gene flow and movement of individuals within populations. And similarly, you might be able to guess which one would you choose from the bottom two. Second one, yes, exactly. And for the same reasons, because you have connectivity, you have these patches of forest in between that connect them, that can act as wildlife corridors. So here, these populations will be much more comfortable in moving between patches. Here also, they will think before they are moving between patches if these are entirely cut off from each other. It is much better if the patches have some amount of wildlife that is connecting them, which encourages the movement of individuals from one patch to another. Okay, moving on to biodiversity hotspots. As we discussed, it is very important to figure out what are the biodiversity hotspots in a particular area, so that you can then move forward and set up your in or carry out your in situ conservation practices. So India has these four major biodiversity hotspots. We have these Himalayas, which extend all the way from Western Himalayas to the Eastern Himalayas. This is a huge biodiversity hotspot. We have this Indo Burma region in East India. You have these very famous Western Ghats and Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is not shown in this map. And you have the Sundaland area in the bottom of the Andaman Nicobar Islands. So these are some very important biodiversity. That is why India is a country, is a nation which is rich in its biodiversity, and we should be taking care and paying more attention to our wildlife, because since these are biodiversity hotspots, the organisms that are found here are not found anywhere else, and once lost, they're lost forever. I know I've been saying it again and again, but it is very important to note this point. Okay, moving on. So, on the left, we have some of the biosphere reserves, and on the right, we have the states that they might be found in. So, can you guys match which biosphere reserve is found in which state? Where do you think is the Gulf of Mannar Biosphere Reserve found?
Andaman and Nicobar. Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you, Ajishri. You're saying Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Okay, fine. We'll like come to the answers later. So, where do you think is the Sundarban?
Sundarban, West Bengal.
Yeah, this would be in the West Bengal, definitely. Nanda Devi Biosphere Reserve?
Meghalaya.
Maybe. I don't think so. Any other guesses?
Uttarakhand.
Uttarakhand, yes. So Nanda Devi is found in Uttarakhand. And so, as you're saying, Afia, you're correct. The Great Nicobar will be found in the Andaman and Nicobar, the Great Nicobar Biosphere Reserve. So Gulf of Mannar is not found in the Andamans and Nicobar. So you can take another guess for this one.
Panchamari and Panchamari. Sikkim. Idu. Fruit
Okay, so
Sikkim.
Afia is saying that Simlipal is found in Odisha. Okay. Then where do you think is the Nokrek Biosphere Reserve found?
Sikkim.
Sikkim. Okay. I will take your guess, but it is not found in Sikkim actually. It is found in Meghalaya. The Kanchenjunga is found in Sikkim.
Kanchenjunga. Kanchenjunga.
Yeah, the Kanchenjunga is found in Sikkim. Moving on, the Panchmarhi Biosphere Reserve is found in, any guesses?
Madhya Pradesh. Madhya Pradesh.
Madhya Pradesh. Okay. Yes. So we have connected most of these dots. So as we discussed, the Gulf of Mannar, this one is found in Tamil Nadu. It's not found in Andaman and Nicobar. This is in Tamil Nadu. Sundarbans, as you said, it's found in West Bengal. Correct. Nanda Devi is in Uttarakhand. Panchmari, as you said, is in Madhya Pradesh. Nokrek is found in Meghalaya. Simlipal is found in Odisha. So you were correct, Afia. Great Nicobar is obvious from the name. It's found in Andaman and Nicobar. Anjanakumar and Amarkantak Biosphere Reserve is found in Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh, and Agastyamalai is in Kerala and Tamil Nadu because you have the Agastyamalai range of mountains. And then there is Kanchenjunga, which is found in Sikkim. So in India, we have 18 biosphere reserves in total. These were some of them, and now you know where they are found. This is a map of the various biosphere reserves that are found in India. And the ones that are star marked are the ones that are recognized by the World Network of Biosphere Reserve. Otherwise, we have these 18. We have the cold desert in Himachal Pradesh, Nanda Devi in Uttarakhand, Kanchenjunga, as we discussed, in Sikkim, Manas Dibru in Assam, Debang in Arunachal Pradesh, Nokrek, as we discussed, in Meghalaya, Sundarbans in Western Ghats, sorry, in West Bengal, Simlipal in Odisha. We have Seshachalam in Andhra Pradesh. We have Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve in Karnataka. You have Agastyamalai, Tamil Nadu in Kerala. Gulf of Mannar is again in Tamil Nadu. Great Nicobar in Andaman Nicobar. Achankamar and Amarkantak in Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh. Pachmarhi Panna in Madhya Pradesh. Panna Biosphere Reserve is another one, and Pachmarhi is a different one. And you have the Kutch in Gujarat. So these are the biosphere reserves that are found in India, and 11 of them are uh, recognized by the World Network Biosphere Reserve. Okay, moving on. So I would like to point out certain differences between a wildlife sanctuary, a biosphere reserve, and a national park connected to World Network. Yeah, so World Network of Biosphere Reserves is a sort of like an organization, sort of like a thing by the UNESCO, like there is the UN, like that there is one of these committees, it's called the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. And all of these that are star marked, they are recognized, as in these are recognized on a world level as a biosphere reserves. Is that okay? Okay. So earlier I also used to get very confused between what are the differences between wildlife sanctuary, biosphere reserves, national parks. I still do. So I would just like to point out what are the certain specific features that categorize or that separate them from each other. So as is written down, a wildlife sanctuary is mostly it's a protected area where animals and birds can live in their native environments without having any threats of poaching or trafficking. But and a wildlife sanctuary is smaller in size if you compare it to biosphere reserves and national parks. A national park is a protected area which can have natural, semi-natural, as well as certain human affected landscape as well, which is then dedicated to the wild nature after that, and it comes under the national park. So it is not necessarily just a just natural habitat or just primary habitat. It can have some of the human impacted areas as well. But a wildlife, on the other hand, is entirely a natural landscape. Biosphere reserve, these are large areas, and these wildlife sanctuaries and national parks sometimes come inside the biosphere reserve. So biosphere reserves are huge areas, and they're meant to protect the biodiversity in general of that area, including the endangered species. So wildlife sanctuary is mostly it is set up around that particular species that you're trying to protect, but the biosphere reserve protects that entire habitat. Okay, and they're vast landscapes, and as I said, they can include multiple national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. Okay, so the objective behind setting up these different in situ conservations are the wildlife sanctuary. The primary purpose is to protect and conserve that particular wildlife species which is endangered, and to conserve their particular habitats. For a national park, It is to protect wildlife and other objects that might be of historical significance. There might be certain, say, human constructions or rock sculptures or things like that that might be of significance that you're trying to protect in that particular area from any damage. And the biosphere reserve, the main objective is to preserve the genetic diversity of that entire area, of that entire ecosystem. You're protecting the wildlife animals, you're protecting the traditional lifestyles, you're like the tribes are allowed to live in that area, and you're also trying to protect the domestic plants and animals also that are found in that area. So as I mentioned earlier, the entire landscape you're trying to protect and not just that particular species. In short, the biosphere reserves, they aim to conserve biodiversity, you are promoting sustainable development, and you're providing support to the local communities and the stakeholders. The local communities basically means the tribes that are found in that area. So you're trying to support them as well, you're trying to protect them uh, in that particular area so that no other industries or humans can set up or urbanize that area. Okay? Okay. Moving on to ex situ conservation. This was discussed in the last lecture. So, what do we mean by ex situ conservation? We've discussed it a lot now. So, can you guys tell me what is ex situ conservation? What are some examples of ex situ conservation? You're conserving outside of the natural habitat, correct? So, what would be some examples of an ex situ conservation? There is a zoo, yeah, and what else? There are other examples of ex situ conservation. There are botanical gardens, seed banks, correct? Okay. So, moving on to what is an ex situ conservation, you're correct. It is conservation that is outside the natural environment, it is off site, and mostly some examples would be zoos, as you mentioned. There's seed banks for plants, there is botanical gardens, then there is captive breeding that you carry out for certain very threatened species, then there are aquariums for aquatic species and things like that. There is like herpetariums for snakes and other reptiles. And why we carry out ex situ conservation is because we need an urgent intervention, maybe because the species numbers are declining beyond, like they cannot be saved anymore in the in situ conservation and they need to be taken up and taken care of specifically. That is why maybe you need an urgent intervention, and it is useful for some species that are critically endangered, and if you want to increase them in numbers and save them from extinction, say there are just 10 individuals left in the entire world, so you would need ex situ conservation in those cases to bring back their numbers. Okay, so what are certain pros and cons of ex situ conservation? Let's first list out some pros of ex situ conservation. Can you guys tell me what are certain pros or certain advantages of carrying out ex situ conservation? Monitoring, yeah, you can easily monitor the species and the number of individuals and their health and things like that, correct? What else? Captive breeding can increase numbers, correct? You will not need to have that huge landscape. Yes, it's going to protect from poaching, but that you're trying to do in situ conservation also as well, right? You have all these forest rangers that are going to carry out, say, patrol all the forest so that there's no poaching activities. So technically you're trying to do that in situ conservation as well, But yeah, you can protect them from poaching, and you will not have to save this huge area, right? You will not have to protect this huge landscape to carry out ex situ conservation. You can do it in a small place. You will have a better control of various things like what diet you are giving, how much the organisms are eating, what is the like the climate, the temperature, the precipitation. You can control that when it's in ex situ, when you're carrying out in a protected area. And then you can also, provide them, you can vaccinate the individuals that will protect them from various diseases that might be there even in situ conservation, but they will not now happen in the ex situ conservation practices. Okay. Then yes, so you use a small area, you don't need that huge area. Then there is, you can have you can closely observe your species. You will be better able to understand various activities that are carried out, how they reproduce, what are the things that they require, how are they selected, how are there's mate choice happening in them. So these things you can better understand, and you can prevent the dropping in their numbers, because there might be something that was getting missed out from you when you're carrying out in situ conservation, but now you might be able to better understand and stop that. And then there is intensive, you can carry out intensive interventions with the species. If there are very low numbers, you can carry out in vitro fertilization. You can collect the eggs from the females and fertilize them with the sperm. So you can do all these things. You don't need to, you can also uh, you can also put in the zygotes into the females so that they are able to, breed and carry out, you know give rise to more progeny. And also you can also take care of injured individuals. If some individuals got injured in the wild, you can bring them, you can take care of these individuals, and you can help them survive. They might have died out if they were left out in the wild, but now they will be able to survive. So, okay, these were certain pros of carrying out ex situ conservation. What would be certain cons of ex situ conservation? Behavioral change, yes, you're correct. So they'll not be able to, they will lose some of their wild behaviors. For example, if it's in the case of carnivores, which are supposed to carry out these, they're supposed to run after the prey, they're supposed to capture them, and they will not be able to do all this because they are getting served in a platter. They're getting their food like chopped up and everything. They will not develop the same hunting skills as their ancestors might have, because they will not have to carry out hunting. It is costly, yes. You're keeping them in captivity, that is also true. So these are some of the cons that are related to an ex situ conservation practice, that you are going to lose out on the wild behavior, and then you're also going to lose out on the various selection pressures that were acting in a naturally selected population of individuals. And this individual might not be the best fit, it might be suboptimal, because you're giving them, a lot of the things are being preserved, a lot of the vaccines are being given to them. They might not be immune to diseases on their own, and if you reintroduce them in the wild, they might not be able to survive anymore. So it does not, yes, if you are protecting them ex situ, you're obviously not protecting the habitat in where they come from. So the habitat might get lost if this species is not being reintroduced. You cannot protect multiple species together. When you're carrying out in situ conservation, you're protecting the entire community, as we discussed in that particular habitat. But here, you're not protecting the community, you're just protecting this particular species that is at hand, that you're paying attention to. It is costly, yes, and it can increase the chances of inbreeding. It can hugely increase the chances of inbreeding, because you, from the wild, you pick up, say, five individuals, you bring them and you use them to re-establish the entire population. That is going to lead to a lot of inbreeding depression, because there is going to be founder effect. Okay, moving on. So even though there are a lot of cons of an ex situ conservation, then you would technically, if one were asked which one would you prefer, in situ or ex situ, one would say in situ conservation. But ex situ has also been successful a lot of these times. And one of the example is the Przewalski's horse. This horse is thought to be one of the, like, it's the last wild horses that is out there. It is not, so there's a debate between whether it's a domesticated horse or it's a wild horse, but it is thought to be one of the last wild horses on earth. It's found in the Gobi Desert. It was found in the Gobi Desert, and then it was facing local extinction. It was last sighted in 1960 in the Magnolian steppes in that area in the Gobi Desert here, which is in the north of China and also in the north of, like, in East India, in East Asia, sorry, in the north of China. So this desert basically is like a very dry climate. It's mostly it's very cold and dry climate in that area, and this population was facing local extinction. It was last found in 1960s, but now because of ex situ conservation, because of intervening with the population, it was brought in. So it is, as I mentioned, it's the last surviving subspecies of wild horse. It was driven to extinction in the wild, but then it was brought in. Certain individuals were brought in, and their populations were tried to re-establish. And they, why they were getting extinct is because they were facing pressures like hunting, competition from livestock, from cattle, from military activities, from changing climate. But then they were captively bred, and these species were reintroduced again into the into the Magnolian Gobi Desert. And now there is around 1900 horses that are alive today. They're all descended from these 14 founder individuals that were caught in those years of 1910 and 1960. So you might think that they might have this founders effect in them. That might be true, but at least we have the species. It is still alive. It's not gone extinct. And now it's found, you can find it in Mongolia, China, and Kazakhstan. You can find it in all these areas. This is Mongolia, this is China, and this is some part of Kazakhstan. So this is one of the success stories of ex situ conservation. It is not always bad. Sometimes it is useful. Other examples would be this. Can you guys guess what are these species? Do you guys know what are these species? So these are other success stories of in ex situ conservation. Yeah, it's a ferret. You're correct. So this is basically the black-footed ferret, as its appearance suggests, and this bird here is the Mauritius fodi. So just like the Przewalski's horse, the black-footed ferret is another species that got extinct in the wild. There were no more ferrets in the wild, but it was saved, and over a period of 10 years there are 18 species whose conservation statuses have been improved by ex situ management. This black-footed ferret, it had gone extinct in the wild, but it is now being reintroduced into its habitat. And here you have this Mauritius fodi, as the name suggests. It was found in Mauritius, in the islands of Mauritius. It's an endemic songbird, and it was getting extinct. It was threatened by the forest clearance and introduced predators. It was not still extinct in the wild, but the numbers were severely low. But then it was successfully translocated in 2005 to this other area, which is this small isle Ox Egretis, which is off the coast of Mauritius. It was an endemic in that particular area earlier in the island of Mauritius, but it has now been translocated, and it is here. It's having a stable population, and the extinction risk is much reduced than before. So these are some of the success stories of uh, ex situ conservation. If you want to look at more, so here is one link. So here is the link in the slideshow. You can look at it later. But there are these 10 inspiring conservation stories that are going to give you hope. So it's not just in situ, ex situ, both of them together can work in like collaboration with each other. And there are a lot of species that have been protected. There is these whales which have been brought back from the brink of extinction. These are these humpback whales. Then there is these effort to save the Red Sea reefs, the coral reefs found in the Red Sea. There is these beaver colonies which are found in England. Then there is this mountain gorillas. Their numbers are also on a rise again. Then there is bald eagle. There is these tigers. We all know India's famous tiger. It's been the numbers have been improved. There are brown pelicans. Then there is the grey wolf, and there are these stellar sea lions, and also the panda. So these are some species that have been saved from extinction, that have been protected by efforts of in situ and ex situ conservation. You can go and you can have a look at these article, and there is this another article here which also tells us about some other conservation stories from these images. So you can look at these two pages. This will give you some more information about all the conservation practices that are being carried out by humans and which of them have been successful. Okay, so this was all I had for today. If you guys have any doubts or you want to talk about something, you want to discuss something, I'm here. We can talk about it. Otherwise, you're free to go. You can leave the meeting if you have no doubts. Thank you for joining. Thank you for listening to today's tutorial. If you guys have any further doubts or would like to discuss something,